Library Foundation event. This is the 10th annual Community Leaders Poetry Reading. And this is the 10th, and I have been to 3 of them, so I've been to 30%, which is pretty good. And I welcome everybody here. We have a special format this year. All of our readers have participated in a previous Community Leaders Poetry Reading, except for the 10th person, who tonight is Opal Weinbrenner, who is one of our newest board members of the Library Foundation Board.
So thank you for the invitation. Thanks to the Library Foundation. Mr. Finn got a hold of me and I said, you bet, I'm in. And Joe, thank you very much. You got us off to a good start here, as you'll see. I brought a book along that I grew up with. It's called Treasury of the Familiar. A whole collection of poems and sayings. And it got me through many an evening of teenage angst at my house. And it was popular with my mom and dad and all my brothers and sisters. And the Psalm of Life was one of my mother's favorite poems. So it was great to lead off with that, Joe. It's right here on page 145 in this book. It's bookmarked. I was going to read it. But, and I don't want to go through my ruminations with you, but I did. I went back and forth, you know, what to read, how to make it meaningful. You do, you know. But I decided, let's just have some fun. Let's enjoy ourselves tonight. And I thought we might start off with a little poetry quiz, okay? So I'll read the first lines of a couple of famous poems, and if you know the poem or the author, just shout it out, and then we'll go on to another one, and maybe I'll stop and read one of them in its entirety. How would that be? That's fun? So this is a pretty famous night in American history, right? 243 years ago this evening, and the poem begins, this is an easy one. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year.
The midnight ride of Paul
Revere. Very good. And of course, we've learned that maybe Paul Revere wasn't the only rider that night. In fact, I believe there was a woman with him named Sybil Luddington, or so my granddaughter tells me. And Ms. Luddington actually housed some of the Minutemen and Patriots in one of her barns that evening, 243 years ago. So, well, how about this one? By the shores of Gitchigumi, by the shining Big Sea water, stood the wigwam of Nokomis, daughter of the moon, Nokomis.
The Legend of Hiawatha.
Very good, Dr. Goldes, yes. Song of Hiawatha, by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And
so who
of course,
wrote the Midnight Ride? Who wrote the Midnight Ride?
That was also Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, yep. You know, and there was a time in this country when every kid growing up knew these poems. And everybody knew that Gitchigumi was the Ojibwe word for Lake Superior, right? Big lake. So my personal theory on this is that had it not been for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and the Song of Hiawatha, Gordon Lightfoot wouldn't have known what Gitchigumi was, and he'd have never been able to write The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. That's the legacy that we share. Well, here's yet another one, okay? This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight, stand like druids of old, with voices sad and prophetic.
Evangeline.
Evangeline, very good, Joe. Also by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He's a great American poet. Here's another little stanza. Ye who believe in affection that hopes and endures and is patient, ye who believe in the beauty and strength of a woman's devotion, list to the mournful tradition still sung by the pines of the forest list to a tale of love in Acadia, home of the happy. And of course, this whole poem deals with the forceful relocation of the Catholic Huguenots from their ancestral home in Acadia, up in the Maritimes of Canada, down into southern Louisiana. And gradually, the Acadians got morphed into Cajuns, so that's where we get our Cajuns from. Here's just one other brief stanza. This is kind of when the redcoats show up at the little village of Grand Bay and tell these people things are going to change. He says, "You are convened this day by His Majesty's orders. Painful the task is I do, which to you I know must be grievous. Yet must I bow and obey and deliver the will of our monarch, namely, that all your lands and dwellings and cattle of all kinds forfeited be to the crown, and that you yourselves from this province be transported to other lands. God grant you may dwell there ever as faithful subjects, a happy and peaceable people. Prisoners now I declare you, for such is His Majesty's pleasure." And, sorry, when Huey Pierce Long ran for governor of Louisiana in 1928, he announced his campaign beneath this huge oak tree in St. Martin's Parish in Louisiana. And he evoked this poem, Evangeline, to the people that were there listening to him. And I can't remember it exactly, but he said something like, "This is the oak tree beneath which Gabriel, or Evangeline, waited in vain for her lover Gabriel. And much as Evangeline waited, the people of Louisiana have waited for the schools that were promised them that have never been built, and for the orphanages and hospitals for the children and the elderly who need the help of society." Now, he really evoked Evangeline to all the Cajun people down there at the time. And he said, "Let me dry those tears and take up the cause." So that's another example, I guess, of the power of poetry, as Joe said. All right, how about one more? Now I'll read this. "Under a spreading chestnut tree." Know that one? The Village Blacksmith, yeah, by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So why don't we read this one? "Under a spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. The smith, a mighty man is he, with large and sinewy hands, and the muscles of his brawny arms are strong as iron bands. His hair is crisp and black and long, his face is like the tan. His brow is wet with honest sweat, he earns whate'er he can. And he looks the whole world in the face, for he knows not any man. Week in, week out, from morn till night, you can hear his bellows blow. You can hear him swing his heavy sledge with measured beat and slow, like a sexton ringing the village bell when the evening sun is low. And children coming home from school look in at the open door. They love to see the flaming forge and hear the bellows roar, and catch the burning sparks that fly like chaff from a threshing floor. He goes to church on Sunday and sits among his boys. He hears the parson pray and preach. He hears his daughter's voice singing in the village choir, and it makes his heart rejoice. It sounds to him like her mother's voice, singing in paradise. He needs must think of her once more, how in the grave she lies, and with his hard, rough hand he wipes a tear out of his eyes. Toiling, rejoicing, sorrowing, onward through life he goes. Each morning sees some task begin, each evening sees it close. Something attempted, something done, has earned a night's repose. Thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught. Thus at the flaming forge of life, our fortunes must be wrought. Thus on its sounding anvil shaped, each burning deed and thought.
What a great evening to be here, to be able to enjoy the art of poetry with other people who are interested in it. For me, spring is here, and we have a number of birds that congregate around our house and get into squabbles with the squirrels. And so I decided that I'd find a poem that expressed some of that. And the poem I'm going to read is called Bird-Witted by Marianne Moore. With innocent, wide penguin eyes, 3 large fledgling mockingbirds below the pussy willow tree stand in a row, wings touching, feebly solemn, till they see their no longer larger mother bringing something which will partially feed one of them. Toward the high-keyed, intermittent squeak of broken carriage springs made by the 3 similar meek-coated bird's-eye freckled forms she comes. And from the beak of one, the still-living beetle has dropped out. She picks it up and puts it in again. Standing in the shade till they have dressed their thickly filamented, pale pussy willow surfaced coats, they spread tail and wings, showing one by one the modest white stripe lengthwise on the tail, and crosswise underneath the wing, and the accordion is closed again. What delightful note, with rapid, unexpected flute sounds leaping from the throat of the astute grown bird, comes back to one from the remote, unenergetic sunlit air before the brute was here. How harsh the bird's voice has become. A piebald cat, observing them, is slowly creeping toward the trim trio on the tree stem. Unused to him, the 3 make room, an easy new problem. A dangling foot that missed its grasp is raised and finds the twig on which it planned to perch. The parent darting down, nerved by what chills the blood, and by hope rewarded of toil, since nothing fills squeaking unfed mouths, wages deadly combat, and half kills with bayonet beak and cruel wings the intellectual, cautiously creeping cat.
I kind of have a neat story, and I have a couple of props. I'm gonna do a couple of poems, but one is a very relatively simple poem, but very meaningful poem, and I just came upon it this last weekend. So our next door neighbors, Cindy and Jim Sheets, are here tonight, and we were at their house for dinner, and I think we were talking about this event, and we're going to do this event, and we began talking about poetry, and then, well, Cindy will help me with this, but we began talking about a poet that they know and a powerful poem that means a lot to them, and this friend of theirs, very close friend of theirs, wrote this poem and gave it to them. And so I'm going to ask Cindy to come up. She's one of my props. My neighbor, they've only been our neighbor for about a year, and it took us that long to finally get together, and finally Cindy had to say, "You're coming over, so get over here." And so this poem was given to them by the author, and it was framed and all of that. And I'm going to read it in just a second, but I'd like Cindy to come back and just tell you really briefly where this poem came from.
Thank you, Andy. Well, a very good friend of mine, Jim Martinez, wrote the poem, The Last Alarm. During his time as president of the Idaho Association of Firefighters, a young firefighter lost his life fighting a fire. He left behind his wife and a 2.5-year-old daughter named Angela. A year later, Jim was elected vice president of the International Firefighters Association. And having never forgotten the young daughter from the fire a year earlier, and never having written a poem before, he began writing one about her. In 1987, U.S. Congress established the International Firefighter Memorial in Colorado Springs. This is the official poem on the memorial, along with the names of fallen firefighters across the United States and Canada. Every September, Jim would attend the service to read the poem. After 9/11, Jim read his poem and told his story on a Boise, Idaho TV station. He mentioned he hadn't seen Angela since her dad passed, so it was announced over the air that anyone knowing the whereabouts of the Parker family, please call the station. 2 days later, Jim was contacted. They had found Angela. She had no idea the poem was written about her and her dad. The professional firefighters of Idaho voted to send Angela and her husband to the memorial service in Colorado. It was the first time Jim had met Angela since she was 2.5 years old. As you can imagine, it was a very emotional meeting. She stood beside him as he read the poem, The Last Alarm.
So that's where that comes from, and Cindy could tell it much better than me. So I asked her to do that. And it is an emotional poem, I believe, and it was dedicated by Tim Martinez, and it was dedicated to children of firefighters that died in the line of duty, and particularly to Angela. But tonight, this reading of it, I'd like to dedicate to Wally Jester. He's here tonight, and he is the fire chief of Lewis and Clark County Fire Department. And I'd like if Wally to stand up really quick. Just He's here tonight with his wife Gail. So to Wally and all the firefighters in Lewis and Clark County and around the world. My father was a fireman. He drove a big red truck. And when he'd go to work each night, he'd say, "Mother, wish me luck." Then Dad would not come home again until sometime the next day. But the thing that bothered me the most was the things that folks would say. A fireman's life is easy. He eats and sleeps and plays. And sometimes he don't fight a fire for days and days and days. Then my father went to work one day, and he kissed us all goodbye. But little did we realize that night we would all cry. My father gave his life that night when the floor gave way below, and I wondered why he'd risk his life for someone he didn't know. But now I realize the greatest gift a man can give is to lay his life upon the line so that someone else might live. So as we go from day to day and we pray to God above, say a prayer for your local fireman. He may save the ones you love. So thank you all. Thank you, Wally, for being here. Really appreciate it. So the poem I was going to read originally tonight is from this book, Horse Feathers, and it was printed here in Helen, Montana, 1941 by Johnny Rich, and the poems in here, many of them are illustrated by Charlie Russell and Shorty Show. So pretty amazing stuff. So that I learned later. As a kid growing up, a couple of my uncles, my father, they knew some of these poems by heart, and they recited them to us as kids. Of course, I've never learned any of them by heart, I'm sorry, and I learned about the lake from the song, so there you go, Jim. That's how young I am. I don't look like it anymore, but I guess I'm slow to get there. Anyway, tonight I'm going to read Shorty's Saloon by Johnny Rich from Horse Feathers. And some of you may know it, I don't know. I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to read part of it, but it's a great poem. By the trails to the past, on the plains of no care, stood Shorty's Saloon, but now it's not there. For Shorty moved camp and crossed the divide, in years long dim and naught else beside. A deep brand of memory brings back the old place, its drinks and its games and many a face. Peers out from the mists of the days that are fled, when Shorty stood back of his bar there and said, "What's yours, pard?" No fine drinks adorned this primitive bar, just liquor was served, and that seemed by far the properest stuff in a place you'll agree, where life flowed and ebbed like the tides of the sea, unfettered by care, unmeasured by time, where innocence formed its first friendship with crime. where Bacchus' wild court held ribaldrous sway, and Shorty on shift, waiting to say, "What's yours, pard?" They danced and they drank and they sang that old song, "I'm just a poor cowboy and I know I've done wrong." While the click of the chips and the games that were played and the sob of the music the violin made rang out through the smoke that clouded the room, for joy held top hand and drink drowned all gloom. The future might hold for him who made gay and life filled with sunbeams when Shorty would say, "What's yours, pard?" Some tragedies mark those trails to the past, some lone, unnamed graves tell briefly the last of the story of those who lived ere the change from the wild, free life of the borderless range. From memory's kind grasp holds gently the place, its drinks, its games, and many a face peers out from the mists of the days that have fled, when Shorty stood back of his bar there and said, "What's yours, pard?"
It's been a pleasure being in this community now for very close to 50 years, practicing law for very close to 50 years. We think of poetry as, I think, as something different than the other ways of communication, but really it is, I think, just a component of how people tell stories. It is how people convey messages. And for some reason, I think this country of ours, this land of ours, brings out writers. And people have written across this country since the native people were here. They left symbols that we still read today. We don't necessarily know all what those handprints and symbols mean, but we know that they are sending a message that people were here, that people cared, and they cared enough to say that they wanted to send a message forward to the future. And that's what writing really is about, is telling stories about the future. That's what this equity fountain concept that I am not going to bore you with, or well, I will, but at a different time. But that's what that is about. So I've always been attracted to individuals who have been able to write about the Montana experience in unique ways, or in special ways. One of the writers that I have always been attracted to is Richard Hugo, who was at the university for the longest time and started the creative writing program there, and was an outstanding poet. And one of the things that Richard did was he went around and he wrote poems about virtually all of the smaller towns in Montana. So there's one about Dickerson, and one about Phillipsburg, and one about a few other places, one about Helena. And I read that over a couple of times and then thought that it was a little bit less than uplifting, but I liked some of the things that Richard Hugo said. He said, what endures is what we have neglected. And he said, we spend our lives remembering what we love to be sure of who we are. I came to Montana in 1960, and the first place that I ended up was in Wisdom. And so the poetry of Richard Hugo is one of the few poets that I know who also visited Wisdom, and he has 2 poems about visiting Wisdom, and I will read one of them, called With Kathy and Wisdom. I've only dreamed that high cliff we were on, overlooking Wisdom and the Big Hole Drain. I dreamed us high enough to not see men, dreaming old land behind us, better left, and we were vagabond. We went twice to Wisdom, not in dream. Once in day, odd couple after Brooks, and then at night, dark derelicts, obsessed with fake false fronts for tourists in the empty church. I dreamed the cliff again, evening, deep beneath, Wisdom turning lights on, neon flakes are planets where we touch. I wake up shouting, wisdom is not that much, and sweating. Wisdom never will be bright. Lord, we need sun. We need moon, fern and mercy, form and dream destroyed. Need the cliff torn down to hold hands and to stare down the rare void of the day. Be my contraband. 3 fat eastern brook at night. That's my private limit. The cliff broke. The winds poured in on wisdom, leaving false fronts really what they seem. Morning wisdom, Kathy, is no dream. I like that poem, and I also like another poet who I've read over the years because he makes sense to me about the things that he sees. And I found this in one of Billy Collins's poems that I thought was important to maybe share with you as well. It's called Today. If ever there was a spring day so perfect, so uplifting by warm intermittent breezes, that it made you want to throw open all the windows in the house and unlatch the door of the canary's cage, indeed rip the little door from its jamb. A day when the cool brick paths in the garden sprouts tulips seemed so etched in sunlight that you felt like taking a hammer to the grass paper weight in the living room end table, releasing the inhabitants from their snow-covered cottage so that they could walk out holding hands and swimming into the larger dome of blue and white. Well, today is just that kind of day.
It's really an honor to be here. When I was invited, this is the second time I've had the chance to do this, and it's considered a community leader event, and to be in a community, be considered a community leader in a place like Helena, Montana is pretty remarkable. We've got a lot of great folks, as you can see around this room. I did have the chance to serve on the board of the Parmley Billings Library Foundation, now the Billings Public Library, for about 10 years. And I had the privilege of being really involved in the campaign that resulted in the new library in Billings, which is now considered one of the most beautiful libraries in the country. And I'm so grateful that I did, because it's probably the only chance I'll ever get to build a public building. I read a lot, but I don't read a lot of poetry. To be honest with you. But every now and then some things come along that stick with me and that I enjoy. And so I've got 2 of them this evening that I want to share with you. One's a little bit serious and one not so much. And you might even recognize one of them. The first is by James A. Autry from his book Love and Profit. Now there's 2 words you don't hear in the same sentence very often, right? I came across Autry's work when I was studying leadership about 20 years ago. I'm actually still studying leadership. His philosophy impacted me and reflected my leadership values. At least I hope that they reflect my leadership values. Autry is a former Fortune 500 executive who became a sort of a missionary to the style of leadership with a heart. He enjoys sharing his message through poetry as well as prose. And so I want to share with you his poem called Threads. Sometimes you just connect like that. No big thing maybe, but something beyond the usual business stuff. It comes and goes quickly, so you have to pay attention. A change in the eyes when you ask about the family. A pain flickering behind the statistics about a boy and a girl in school. Or about seeing them every other Sunday. An older guy talks about his bride. A little affection after 25 years. A hot-eyed achiever laughs before you want him to. Someone tells about his wife's job, or why she quit working to stay home. An old joker needs another laugh on the way to retirement. A woman says she spends a lot of her salary on an au pair, and a good one is hard to find, but worth it because there's nothing more important than the baby. Listen, in every office you hear the threads of love and joy and fear and guilt, the cries for celebration and reassurance, and somehow you know that connecting the threads is what you are supposed to do, and business will take care of itself. That's the serious one. This next one goes back about, well, several years. I first heard this on the banks of the Smith River. And it was a beautiful night, just about this time of year. Clear sky, bright stars, nice campfire, good company, and a tin cup full of brown liquor. And my friend Steve Gamble from Bozeman recited this, and I've enjoyed it ever since. Some of you have probably heard this. It's by one of our Montana poets, Wally McCrae, Tongue River Valley rancher and cowboy poet, and it's called Reincarnation. What does reincarnation mean? A cowpoke asked his friend. His pal replied, it happens when your life has reached its end. They comb your hair and wash your neck and clean your fingernails and lay you in a padded box away from life's travails. The box in you goes in a hole that's been dug in the ground. Reincarnation starts in when you're planted neath a mound. Them clods melt down just like your box, and you who is inside, and then you're just beginning on your transformation ride. In a while the grass will grow up on your rendered mound, till someday on your moldered grave a lonely flower is found. And say a hoss should wander by and graze upon the flower that once was you and now's become your vegetative bower. The posy that the hoss done ate up with his other feed makes bone and fat and muscle essential to the steed. But some is left that he can't use, and so it passes through, and finally lays upon the ground that thing that once was you. Then say by chance I wanders by and sees this on the ground, and I ponders and I wonders at this object that I've found. I think of reincarnation, of life and death and such. I come away concluding, Slim, you ain't changed all that much.
Our Montana poet laureate is Lowell Jager this year. And when I read this poem, I just thought it was great. It's about horses. I'm not wild about horses, my daughter was, but it's just beautiful. So here goes. Gratitude. I'm driving the long way home, meandering along a back road meadow, where I've stalled to breathe and watch the horses play. Let their blood and flesh grazing knee-deep in fireworks of wildflowers lift me. Why do I say play? Horses I've known up close shudder and twitch with nervous alert. Poor brutes, fenced to boredom, plagued with flies, thistles, and thirst. And yet, they do play. They step toward me, shyly as if to welcome me, as if to ask what news I might bring. And I answer by stroking their necks, resting a hand in the softness of their necks, just above the nostrils, where they inhale my gratitude. And graciously stand with me, as if to confirm the world's possibilities, foremost of which, despite our separate hardships, is the goodness of this day.
I'm Heather, I'm the Teen Services Librarian, and before I start talking about Delaney, because that's what I'm going to do before I'm going to read, I'm just going to brag about our library board and our library foundation board for about a minute. I encounter a lot of other librarians at conferences who are like, oh man, my board, I can't do. That's kind of the refrain over and over and over again. And consistently, this library, we're so privileged to have an amazing group of trustees and an amazing group of foundation board members who support us, and then the community at large that supports the foundation and the board. So thank you for being here as a staff member and for doing all of those things. So, but about Delaney, because she is also awesome. So in the time that I have known Delaney, they have been active at school, at the Holter Museum of Art and the ATTACK program there. They started a band called The Drinkers, which was ukulele based and made songs all about hydration. Water is very important. And spent just tons and tons of time here at the library, being involved in programs and our teen advisory group. So community, supportive people and supportive organizations is really, really, really important to Delaney. And they've grown as a leader, a person who cares for the people and the places that they're in, and who's always looking for a way to contribute. Because Delaney has experienced great leadership in Helena as a young person. So Delaney's not here because she's currently touring Brown and RISD, where she was accepted into a highly, highly competitive dual degree program to study art and animation. And I wanted to share something that she wrote recently and posted on her Facebook page, but that I think reflects the appreciation for the impact of community on their life's trajectory. And then I'll read the poem that Delaney selected. So these are Delaney's words. Received my final college decision, Stanford, bolded, accepted, and finally took my first real breaths in September. Final college stats, applied, 23, accepted, 15, waitlisted, 2, rejected, 5. Growing up, I never thought I'd be able to go to college, especially at some of the extremely prestigious universities I was accepted into. I could only do that with the outrageous amount of support from a lot of people. Like Gabriella, who was such an inspiration, and without her encouragement, I definitely would not have applied. Jamie for being my Helena icon and paving the way for kids like us. Questbridge, who gave me connections with other talented students and fee waivers.